Okay, welcome to week 14 of our study. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. And so, what I'm going to do here is read the last couple of verses to help us reunite with where we quit. We quit in verse 12, so I'm going to pick up at verse 7. It says, Now war rose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows his time is short. All right, verse 13 and 14. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. So if you think other weeks have been confusing, hold on to your britches, because this one doesn't get any better. So in verse 6 of chapter 12, it talked about the woman. It said, The woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Do you remember what we said that 1,260 days represented?
Yep, 3.5 years.
So if it's a literal interpretation, yes, it's 3.5 years. And if you're a dispensationalist or a pre-tribulation, premillennial rapture believer, then those folks take this as a very literal 3.5 years. If you're a post-tribulation premillennial, as in the church will go through the trials of these tribulations and then be raptured at the beginning of the 1,000-year reign, then maybe not. It might be a little more figurative, as meaning a short time. And we'll address that again. The enemy was thrown out of heaven and cannot unseat the Christ. So he changes tactics and wages war on the church, on God's chosen, the Jews. By doing this, Satan believes he can disrupt God's plans and change the future. But just as was said in verse 6, here John tells us that God hides the woman for a time, times, and half a time. What does the woman represent?
Did we decide Israel was the unlikelihood?
Okay. Got any thoughts, Lynn?
I don't know. I don't have a
Yep.
clue unless it's the church.
Yep, and that's what it is. It's the whole church, Mike, New and Old Testament age. But in this case, obviously, the church is represented by those that are hiding whenever this period is taking place. So it's the past church, the present church, and the future church. Within this context, we talked about a time, times, and half a time kind of representing 3.5 years, but this is a hard one. We've seen this phrase used to define a short time. Dispensationalist pre-tribulation believers would say this is a literal 3.5 years, which makes the tribulation period a literal 7 years, while post-tribulation or futurist view scholars believe this is a figurative time frame, but speaks of a shorter time. It could be 3.5 years, could be 2,350 years, but it considering eternity, it's a shorter time. In this case, I believe it speaks not necessarily to a specifically defined 3.5 years, but to the entire life of the church. And I could be wrong. So just keep that in mind. Let's take a look at Isaiah here. He says, "What do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary, and his understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." The whole point of this is that God will help us persevere when perseverance is needed, but we have to wait on him for that. We have to trust in him for that. Any thoughts about that 3.5 years or the times and half a time before we move on? All right, verses 15 through 17. "The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea."
He, the dragon?
Yes. Yeah. So the river pouring out of the mouth of the serpent is figurative, just as was the fire coming from the mouths of the witnesses. But what do you think that the river pouring from the mouth of the serpent is figurative for, is symbolic of?
Something to just sweep away the church? Get rid of it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's as good as any guess that a scholar has, Lynn. I mean, it's just really debated of what this means. I think that the consensus on the 5 commentaries I looked at on this talked about that they think it's the enemy trying to destroy the church from within, using false prophets and false teachings to deceive. That's the flood of deception. But that's probably our best conjecture and a bad guess. I don't know. It's as good as anything. But we do know that the flood is an allusion to 3 Old Testament times. First one is Israel being blocked from escaping Egypt by the Red Sea. The second, the promise in Isaiah that God will see his people through the waters of the enemy's attacks. And third, God's promise to Daniel that an end-time attack will include a flood. So we take that for what it's worth. We look at Isaiah 43:2. "When you pass through the waters, God said, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. And when you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you." And then that passage in Daniel says this: after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and its sanctuary. And the end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And we kind of saw a hint of this last week when we talked about the enemy taking over the outer courtyard and destroying the outer portion of the temple. God's true church hiding within. And they came like a flood. So, verse 16 says that the earth came to the help of the woman and swallowed the flood. If the idea is right that the flood is a massive attempt from within the church to deceive through false teachings, what might the earth be?
Hmm.
Okay. So the common,
God?
what's that?
You got it?
Well, I think that's a fair try. Yeah. It's God's rescuing and protection of the church through the power and authority of the true word defeating the false prophets, coming through preachers and teachers that teach the truth. So, let's talk about the woman and her offspring. I'm going to read verse 17 again. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. I'm just going to read some stuff here. This verse is probably one of the most debated in all of this book. It centers around the difference between the woman and her offspring. Here's the best idea that I could find in all of the arguments that I read. The woman represents the whole church as the bride of Christ. The offspring seems to represent the individual believers within the church. And so when he couldn't defeat the church as a whole by defeating Christ on the cross, and then by wiping out the Jewish people, he went to war against individual believers to deceive them. There are a number of other options to consider, but and to explain them all and to do them justice would really take most of our time today. And I would tell you the same thing, that I believe this makes the most sense to me. But if you're interested, you can go to Google and just type in explain Romans Revelation 12:17, and you'll get a whole plethora of some good and some kind of silly ideas. So I think this one has the most conservative scholarship in its camp. So, thoughts? Moving on up.
So
Go ahead.
he couldn't get the church, so he went to the people and had them form the ELCA. Sorry.
And well, I understand that's what you left, and the United Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church USA and
Mhm.
the
Yep.
As a side note, I read yesterday that the United Methodist Church is now requiring all seminarians to take, it was either one or two classes on the LGBTQ agenda and how to integrate it into the church as part of seminary now. So
Do you think we're in the end times?
I think we're dancing really close on the edge of it. Yeah, we might have 100 years left, but we're moving so fast forward with all of this stuff. It's hard to believe how we can't be just really getting into it. I mean, 2 earthquakes this week, one that killed they're projecting more than 10,000 will be dead in Myanmar. Thailand is horrific as well. I read a scientific article this week that the Earth's core is starting to reverse its spin. How they know that, I have no idea. But that would tear the Earth apart without question, and if that's true. So interesting stuff. All right, we're done with chapter 12. We're just gonna go. I may bore the tears out of y'all tonight. This is going faster than I thought. Verses 1 and 2 of Revelation 13. I'll start talking slower.
No.
And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to the dragon it gave his power and his throne and great authority. This is still part of the vision that John was getting in the beginning of chapter 12, so we haven't changed. But let's take a closer look at the beast in Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king, you have to have a seminary degree to be able to do that. King of Babylon, Daniel saw in a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. And he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, like a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise and devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before, and it had 10 horns. You remember we talked about 10 horns last week, and then we did again today. It describes that. Or it will describe that here soon. But let's back up a little bit. Let's look at the vision. The first one was a lion that had eagle's wings, something like a lion, had eagle's wings, but when it got onto land, the wings were plucked off, and it was lifted from the ground, made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. This describes something very specific. What does it describe? Mike? Think spiritual realm stuff here. This is the emergence of a demonic being that then possesses a person to use for its purposes. And so a lot of scholars question whether this is either the politician or the Antichrist. Let's compare the dragon and the beast. In chapter 12, verse 3, this is how the dragon is defined. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads 7 diadems. The beast, 13:1, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, and with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. So here we saw the beast that rised out of the sea again that Daniel talked about, that then became like a man and was given the mind of a man. So if we look at these comparisons side by side, this is what we get. The dragon, which we believe in and pretty much know to be Satan, the enemy. That's what Satan means. 7 heads. The beast, which in this case gets very confusing, but we're going to call the Antichrist, also 7 heads. They each have 10 horns. The dragon has 7 crowns on his head, and the beast has 7 crowns on his horns. So he has 10 horns, but only 7 crowns. And that's the major difference between these two, is that on the dragon, the crowns are on his head, and on the beast, the crowns are on on his horns. Okay. Any questions before I move on?
What about all the names?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't give us any more detail. And I read some things that were just ridiculous conjecture because it doesn't give us even a hint. So there's no sense in trying to believe we could understand that. What is the difference between the horns on the head, or the crowns on the head, and the crowns on 7 of the 10 horns, do you think? The crowns on the dragon's head represent his assumption of authority and his assumption of power, and his arrogance. The 10 crowns on the 10 crowns, 7 crowns on the
10 horns.
the 7 crowns on the 10 horns represent, Daniel's going to tell us. Daniel 7. As for the 10 horns, out of his kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and there shall be another that arise after them, and he shall be different from the former ones. So the 10 crowns represent, or the 10 horns represent 10 kings. So if we take that here, then we would say 3 of those kings are kind of powerless compared to the others. And these are not spiritual, these are physical nations that will go to war against Christ in the final battle.
Be right back. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So we looked at Daniel. Revelation 13, 3 and 4. One of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, for he has given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? Let's talk about this mortal wound on the head of the beast. Now, if you read ahead in chapter 13, what causes the wound to the beast? Did you read ahead? And if you do you remember? Okay, neither of you did. So in verse 13, or 14, it says the beast was wounded by a sword and yet lived. Okay. So the beast was attacked and lived through the attack. Keep in mind who we're talking about here. What does this wound imitate? What does it mimic?
Suffering of Christ.
Okay. The wound that Christ took, that took his life, right? Only where Christ died, the beast lived. And it says here,
So did Christ.
well, depends on who's telling the story, right? I mean, we know he did, but how many of your neighbors believe that? Right? And that's because of the work that the enemy has done. And it says, and they worship the dragon, for he's given his authority to the beast. And they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast? He can't be killed. Who can fight against him? And so this beast is accepted where Christ is rejected by humankind. With this in mind, who would we make the assumption that the beast would be?
I thought
Not
we said
the-
I thought we said it was the Antichrist.
Right, it is. But what's the problem with that? We've already said that the beast in earlier chapter was the political figure, right? And so it just continues to confound us a little bit. But it seems pretty cut and dry that this reference to this beast, whether it's the same beast that rised out of the pit or not, seems to be the Antichrist who will fool people into thinking that God has returned.
So Daniel refers to 4 beasts,
Yes.
and this is a reference to a singular beast.
Yeah. So some scholars say all 4 of those roll up into this one. Some say that they're just other demonic powers that are subject to the authority of this beast, which is the one that crawled up and had the wings plucked and was given the figure of a man. And so, yeah. Clear as pond water, isn't it?
Not that clear.
You should see some Midwest ponds. We may not know every little detail here, but we know that the dragon is bad, the beast is bad, the beast claims to be God. He's wounded probably in an assassination attempt, and the sword doesn't necessarily mean an edged weapon. And he survives that assassination attempt when he should have died. And because of that, the whole earth marvels and worships him. And he points to the dragon, and people worship the dragon because of him. So, bad times are coming.
You're not
And I
talking
thought
about
this would
Trump.
take us. What's that?
You're not talking about Trump surviving an assassination attempt, right?
I'm not.
Okay.
Scripture might be. I don't know. I get the feeling, though. I mean, I think most of us could live with our earshot off. So I'm guessing that that's not what we're talking about here. This sounds like a very specific and grievous wound, one that somebody shouldn't have lived for. None of us marveled. Now, we marveled that Trump didn't get hit in the side of the head by that bullet. At least I do, right? He just turned his head at the last second and the bullet caught his ear. But this seems to be someone that's taken a very direct hit somehow to the head. and yet survives whole out of the deal. So,
A mortal
but
one.
frankly, and I know that, it wouldn't surprise me if a Trump-like figure, even from the quote unquote right, became an antichrist type of figure. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
They'll be pretty easy to identify,
It should
right?
be, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
like if he's the guy that's saying that Jesus isn't God, right? He's
right,
that guy.
right,
So
right. Which does not fit our current president, who continues not to point people to Jesus, unfortunately, but at least pointing people to God. And now, if he can turn it into a false God, well, then maybe he would be, right? Or if he starts pointing people to himself, then maybe it would be. But at this point, he's not doing those things. So, yeah.